71% of Earth is underwater, and scattered across the ocean floor are the ruins of cities older than the pyramids. Cities that, according to everything we think we know about history, shouldn't exist. For generations, the story of civilization has seemed clear and simple. Humanity began building cities around 5,000 years ago. In places like Egypt and Mesopotamia, early societies learned how to farm, organize governments, and construct the first large settlements. That is the version of history taught in textbooks. But beneath the surface of the world's oceans, a different story may be waiting. A story hidden beneath waves, sand, and centuries of silence. Because over the past few decades, divers, fishermen, and marine archaeologists have begun to find something unexpected on the seafloor. Walls, stone streets, foundations of buildings, entire layouts of ancient settlements preserved beneath layers of water and sediment. At first, these discoveries seemed like isolated curiosities, small ruins near coastlines, perhaps the remains of ports or harbors swallowed by the sea long ago. But as exploration continued, a pattern began to emerge. Across different continents and different oceans, the same kind of structures kept appearing. Cities, not just villages or temporary camps, planned settlements with streets, houses, courtyards, and public spaces, places where people once lived, worked, traded, and built communities. And in many cases, these cities are astonishingly old. Older than the great civilizations of the ancient world. Older than Greece. Older than Rome. Some may even be older than the pyramids themselves. If that is true, it raises a troubling question. How could entire cities disappear beneath the ocean? And if they did, how many more are still hidden in the darkness below? Because the ocean is vast, and we have explored only a tiny fraction of its floor. Somewhere beneath those waters lie drowned coastlines, lost landscapes, and perhaps entire chapters of human history that no one alive today has ever seen. But one of the most extraordinary discoveries lies in a place where the sea is calm, shallow, and deceptively ordinary. A place where, beneath a few meters of Mediterranean water, divers found something that should not have been there. The ruins of an ancient city. A city that had been sleeping beneath the waves for thousands of years. For most of human history, archaeologists searched for the past on land. They dug beneath deserts, they explored caves and valleys, they uncovered ruins buried under soil and jungle. The ocean, by contrast, was rarely considered a place where ancient cities might be found. It was simply too large, too deep, too difficult to explore. But technology began to change that. With the development of sonar mapping, underwater photography, and modern diving equipment, scientists slowly began to examine the seafloor in ways that had never been possible before. And when they did, something unexpected began to appear. Ancient landscapes. River valleys carved into the seabed. Submerged forests where tree trunks still stood upright beneath the water. And in some places, something even more extraordinary. The unmistakable geometry of human construction. Straight lines, rectangular foundations, stone walls forming the shapes of streets and buildings. Evidence that these places were once dry land. Evidence that people had once lived there. And in some cases, evidence that entire settlements had vanished beneath the rising ocean. These discoveries forced researchers to reconsider a simple but powerful idea. Throughout history, humans have always preferred to live near water. Rivers provided fresh drinking water. Coastlines offered food, transportation, and trade. Nearly every major civilization in history grew beside the sea, which means the most valuable places for ancient settlements, the places where early communities were most likely to grow, are also the places most likely to be underwater today. If that is true, then much of humanity's early history may now lie beneath the ocean, hidden beneath waves that slowly rose over thousands of years. Cities that once stood along coastlines may now rest silently on the seabed, their streets buried in sand, their buildings covered in coral, their stories forgotten, unless someone finds them. And over the past few decades, archaeologists have begun to do exactly that. From the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, from the North Sea to the waters of Japan, divers are uncovering a growing list of submerged settlements that challenge what we thought we knew about early civilization. Some are small, some are enormous, and some are so mysterious that scientists still debate whether they were built by humans at all. But the first city we are about to explore leaves little room for doubt. It lies just off the southern coast of Greece, beneath clear blue water, and its streets have been preserved beneath the sea for nearly 3,000 years. But the truth behind this story is far stranger. Long before the pyramids rose above the deserts of Egypt, before the first kings ruled the cities of Mesopotamia, the world looked very different from the one we know today. The coastlines were not where they are now. The oceans were smaller, and vast regions of land that lie beneath water today were once dry ground. To understand why entire cities can now be found beneath the sea, we have to travel back to the end of the last ice age, a time when enormous glaciers covered much of the northern hemisphere. At its peak, the ice age locked unimaginable amounts of water inside massive ice sheets that stretched across continents. Some glaciers were more than 2 kilometers thick, pressing down on the land beneath them with incredible weight. Because so much water was trapped in ice, global sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. Not by a few meters, but by nearly 120 meters. To visualize that difference, imagine standing at the edge of a modern coastline and watching the ocean slowly retreat until it drops the height of a 40-story skyscraper. What would be revealed would not just be beaches or shallow seabeds. Entire landscapes would appear. Vast plains that once lay hidden beneath the ocean would stretch out toward the horizon. River valleys would wind through the exposed terrain. Forests and grasslands would cover areas that today are nothing but open water. During the Ice Age, these landscapes were real. Where waves now roll across continental shelves, there were once fertile lands where animals grazed, rivers flowed, and humans traveled in search of food and shelter. And these lands were enormous. In northern Europe, a massive region connected what is now the island of Britain to mainland Europe. Today, the North Sea fills that space, but thousands of years ago, it was a vast plain of rivers, wetlands, and forests inhabited by animals like mammoths, giant deer, and wild horses. Across Southeast Asia, the islands we know today, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo, were once connected to the mainland by an immense tropical landmass. Dense forests covered the landscape, and countless rivers flowed across the plains before emptying into distant seas. Even along the coasts of the Americas, the land extended far beyond modern shorelines. Areas that are now deep underwater were once open terrain where early human groups could hunt, travel, and establish settlements. These exposed coastal plains would have been some of the most attractive places for ancient people to live. The climate near the ocean was often more stable than inland regions. Rivers carried fresh water across fertile soil. Fish and shellfish provided reliable sources of food. Natural harbors allowed early boats to travel along coastlines and between communities. For people living thousands of years ago, these places were ideal. They offered resources, mobility, and connection. And wherever humans find such advantages, settlements tend to appear. Small camps become villages. Villages grow into towns. And eventually, towns can become cities. For generations, historians believed that the first true cities appeared roughly 5,000 years ago in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt. According to this view, earlier humans lived mostly in small communities, scattered groups of farmers or hunter-gatherers who had not yet developed complex urban societies. But that assumption depends on one crucial limitation. Almost all archaeological discoveries come from land that still exists above sea level. Ruins buried in deserts can be excavated. Structures hidden beneath jungles can be uncovered. Artifacts preserved in caves or dry soil can survive for thousands of years. But what happens when an entire region disappears beneath the ocean? What happens to settlements built on coastlines that no longer exist? The answer is simple. They vanish from history. Over thousands of years, the Ice Age slowly came to an end. The climate warmed, glaciers began to melt, rivers of water poured back into the oceans, and as the ice retreated, sea levels began to rise. Not suddenly, not in a single catastrophic moment, but steadily, century after century. Coastlines moved inland, low plains flooded, river valleys became bays and estuaries, and slowly the landscapes where early humans once lived began to disappear beneath the rising sea. For the people who lived on those ancient coastlines, the change may have been gradual enough that it felt almost invisible. A shoreline that moved a few meters each year, a fishing ground that slowly sank beneath deeper water, a village that eventually had to move inland. But over thousands of years, the cumulative effect was enormous. Entire regions vanished. Places that had once been thriving landscapes became part of the ocean floor, and with them disappeared countless traces of the people who had once lived there. Unless something survived, unless a settlement was preserved beneath the water protected by layers of sand and sediment. And in rare cases, that is exactly what happened. Because beneath the waves of the Mediterranean Sea, archaeologists would eventually discover one of the clearest examples of a drowned ancient city ever found. A city whose streets and buildings remained visible even after thousands of years underwater. A place that would challenge the idea that early complex settlements were rare before the rise of classical civilizations. But the story of that city did not begin with archaeologists. It began with a diver. For thousands of years, the coastlines of the ancient world were alive with human activity. Where land met the sea, people gathered. Fishing grounds provided reliable food. Rivers carried fresh water and fertile soil. Natural harbors offered protection for boats traveling along the shore. Even long before the rise of great empires, coastlines were natural centers of human life. Small communities appeared near bays and river mouths. People built simple shelters, gathered shellfish along tidal flats, and traveled between neighboring groups using the sea as a highway. Over time, these settlements often grew. A temporary camp could become a seasonal village. A village could expand as families returned year after year to the same safe harbor. Trade routes could emerge between communities separated by long stretches of coastline. And where trade flows, societies begin to change. Ideas move, tools spread, skills improve. People build more permanent structures. Archaeologists today know that even very early coastal communities were far more sophisticated than once believed. They built fishing technology, organized seasonal migrations, and developed complex knowledge of tides, currents, and navigation. But the physical evidence of those societies is incredibly fragile. Wood decays, rope disintegrates. Homes built from simple materials vanish over time. If a settlement was abandoned on dry land, it might leave only faint traces behind, fragments of pottery, stone tools, or dark soil where fires once burned. But if a settlement was slowly flooded by rising seas, something very different could happen. Water can sometimes preserve what time would otherwise destroy. Sediment settles across the ruins. Sand covers foundations. Marine growth protects stone surfaces from erosion. In some cases, underwater sites can remain astonishingly intact for thousands of years. Instead of collapsing or being dismantled by later generations, buildings simply remain where they were when the water arrived. Walls stay standing. Streets remain visible. Entire layouts of ancient settlements become frozen in time beneath the sea. It is an eerie kind of preservation. Cities that once echoed with voices and movement become silent landscapes, visited only by fish and divers. For centuries, these drowned places remained completely unknown. Fishermen passed above them without realizing what lay below. Ships sailed across waters that concealed the remains of ancient communities. Generations of people lived and died without ever suspecting that lost settlements rested quietly on the seabed. Then, during the 20th century, something began to change. Exploration technology improved. Divers could stay underwater longer. Marine archaeologists developed new tools to study submerged landscapes. And slowly, piece by piece, the hidden world beneath coastal waters began to reveal its secrets. In some places, fishermen dragging nets across the seabed began pulling up objects that did not belong to the natural environment. Stone tools, fragments of pottery, bones from animals that had lived thousands of years earlier. These strange discoveries hinted that something unusual might lie beneath the water, but it was divers who first began to see the shapes clearly. While exploring shallow coastal areas, they sometimes noticed patterns beneath the sand, lines of stone that formed right angles, rows of blocks arranged too precisely to be natural, structures that resembled walls or foundations. At first, many of these observations were dismissed as coincidence. Nature can create surprising shapes in rock formations. Currents can shift stones into unusual arrangements. Without careful study, it can be difficult to tell whether something underwater was shaped by geology or by human hands. But in certain places, the evidence was unmistakable. Straight streets, buildings with multiple rooms, courtyards and pathways connecting different parts of a settlement, features that only organized human communities could have created. And one of the most remarkable of these places lies off the southern coast of Greece. The waters there are calm and clear, revealing the seabed beneath them with unusual clarity. On a sunny day, the sunlight reaches deep enough to illuminate the shapes resting quietly below. Divers exploring this region began to notice something extraordinary. Beneath the surface, stone structures stretched across the seabed in a pattern that looked strikingly familiar. A grid. Rows of buildings, narrow streets winding between rectangular foundations. It looked less like a random scattering of ruins and more like the layout of an entire town. And the deeper researchers looked, the more astonishing the discovery became. This was not a harbor. Not a single building, not the remains of a shipwreck. It was an entire city. A city whose streets and houses had been preserved beneath the Mediterranean Sea for thousands of years. A place where people once walked, traded, and built their lives long before classical Greece emerged as a civilization. Today we know this drowned settlement by a quiet name, Pavlopetri. But when the first divers saw those structures beneath the water, they had no idea they were looking at one of the oldest submerged cities ever discovered. And the moment that discovery happened would change the way archaeologists thought about ancient coastal civilizations forever. The discovery of Pavlopetri did not begin with a large archaeological expedition. There were no research vessels scanning the Mediterranean for lost cities. No international team searching deliberately for ancient ruins beneath the sea. Instead, the story began quietly, with a diver exploring shallow water along the southern coast of Greece. In 1967, a British marine geologist named Nicholas Fleming was studying coastal geology in the Peloponnese region. The waters there are unusually clear, and in calm weather the seabed can be seen from the surface. Fleming had spent years examining coastlines and underwater formations, searching for clues about how ancient shorelines had changed over time. Rising and falling sea levels leave subtle marks on the landscape, and marine geologists often study these patterns to reconstruct the geography of the distant past. On that particular day, the sea was calm. Sunlight passed easily through the water, illuminating the sandy seabed below. Small patches of seagrass swayed gently with the current, and scattered stones lay across the bottom. At first, nothing seemed unusual. But as Fleming swam farther from the shoreline, something caught his attention. Shapes. Not random stones or jagged rocks, but shapes that seemed strangely regular. Flat surfaces, straight edges, lines that ran longer and straighter than natural rock formations usually allow. Curious, he descended closer to the seabed to take a better look. The shapes became clearer. What had looked like scattered blocks from a distance now appeared to form the outlines of structures. Stones lay in rows, Some sections formed corners where two lines met at near-perfect right angles. Fleming had seen natural formations created by erosion and tectonic movement before, but these patterns did not look natural. They looked organized. The closer he looked, the more the pattern emerged. Rectangular foundations appeared beneath thin layers of sand. Narrow gaps separated clusters of stones, almost like passageways between buildings. What he was seeing began to resemble something unmistakable: a street. At first, the idea seemed unlikely. Ancient ruins could certainly exist near the coast of Greece. The region is filled with archaeological sites dating back thousands of years. But finding the remains of a structure underwater was still rare in the 1960s. Finding something that looked like an entire settlement was even more unusual. Fleming surfaced and reported what he had seen. Soon afterward, archaeologists from the University of Cambridge joined him to investigate the site more carefully. If the shapes truly were the remains of buildings, the discovery could represent one of the earliest known examples of a submerged coastal settlement. Divers returned to the area equipped with measuring tools and underwater cameras. Slowly, methodically, they began to map the seabed. And as the survey progressed, the picture that emerged became increasingly astonishing. The stones were not random debris. They formed structures. Entire buildings appeared beneath the water, their foundations still clearly visible despite thousands of years of submersion. Walls extended across the seabed in long, straight lines. Rooms could be identified inside some of the structures. Between these buildings ran narrow streets. The layout stretched across a surprisingly large area. Divers swam along what had once been pathways through the town, moving between blocks of buildings that had stood side by side when the settlement was alive. Some structures appeared to be simple homes with several rooms. Others were larger and more complex. Open spaces between buildings suggested courtyards or communal areas where people may once have gathered. The longer archaeologists studied the site, the clearer it became that this was not just a small cluster of ruins. It was a town, a carefully organized settlement built according to a plan, and that discovery alone was enough to surprise researchers, because cities do not appear randomly. They require social organization, cooperation, and knowledge of architecture and planning. They reflect communities large enough to support structured living spaces, defined streets, and shared public areas. Yet here was a town resting quietly beneath the Mediterranean Sea. A town that had once been alive with activity, people walking its streets, working inside its homes, trading goods with neighboring settlements. Now it was silent. Fish moved through doorways where families had once lived. Sand drifted slowly across the foundations of buildings that had stood for centuries before the sea arrived. It was as if time itself had stopped. But the greatest surprise was still to come. Because once archaeologists began analyzing artifacts found near the site, they realized that Pavlopetri was not only remarkably well preserved, it was astonishingly old, older than many historians would have thought possible for such an organized settlement. And that raised an even deeper mystery. If Pavlopetri had once been a thriving town thousands of years ago, how many other cities might still be hidden beneath the sea? Once the initial surveys confirmed that Pavlopetri was a genuine settlement, archaeologists began a far more careful investigation of the site. Underwater archaeology is slow and meticulous work. Every movement must be controlled, every measurement carefully recorded. Visibility can change from hour to hour as currents shift the sand across the seabed. But the clear Mediterranean waters around Pavlopetri offered a rare advantage. Divers could see the ruins with unusual clarity. As the research team returned again and again to the site, they began mapping the city in greater detail. Using measuring tapes, underwater cameras, and later advanced sonar equipment, they slowly reconstructed the layout of the settlement. What emerged from those surveys was astonishing. Pavlopetri was not a random collection of buildings scattered along the seabed. It was a carefully organized town. Streets ran between blocks of structures in a recognizable pattern. The pathways connected groups of buildings that appeared to have been constructed according to a deliberate plan. Some streets were narrow passages winding between houses. Others were wider, suggesting main routes that once guided movement through the settlement. Inside the buildings themselves, the foundations of multiple rooms were visible. Some structures appeared simple and compact, perhaps the homes of ordinary families. Others were larger and more complex. In certain areas, archaeologists identified what may have been courtyards or open communal spaces. These areas could have served as gathering points where people met, traded goods, or carried out daily activities. The town even appeared to have a kind of urban zoning. Some sections contained clusters of residential structures. Other areas seemed more open, possibly used for storage or public functions. This level of organization surprised researchers. Urban planning is not something typically associated with extremely early settlements. It suggests a community large enough to require structure and cooperation, a place where people were not simply surviving, but building a functioning society. But the layout of the town was only one piece of the puzzle. To understand when Pavlopetri had existed, archaeologists needed evidence that could be dated. Artifacts, fragments of pottery, tools, organic remains, anything that could reveal when people had lived in this now submerged city. Carefully, divers began searching the seabed around the structures. Over time, they recovered objects that had once been part of daily life in the town. Pieces of ceramic pottery, stone tools, fragments of containers that may have been used to store food or goods. These artifacts were examined and compared with known examples from other archaeological sites across the Mediterranean. And the results were remarkable. The pottery styles suggested that Pavlopetri had been inhabited during the Bronze Age, around 5,000 years ago. That meant the town had been active at roughly the same time that early civilizations were flourishing in places like Egypt and the Near East. But the story did not end there. Further evidence suggested that the site might be even older. Some artifacts indicated that people had been living in this area long before the Bronze Age settlement appeared. In other words, Pavlopetri may not represent a single moment in history. It may represent layers of human occupation stretching across many centuries. Communities building, rebuilding, and expanding the town over generations. And all of it had eventually ended up beneath the sea. But how? Why would an entire town vanish beneath the Mediterranean? The most likely explanation lies in the powerful geological forces that shape the Greek landscape. This region sits along active tectonic boundaries where earthquakes have occurred for thousands of years. Sudden shifts in the earth can cause land to sink or coastlines to change dramatically. Combined with the slow rise of sea levels after the Ice Age, these forces may have gradually submerged the town. What was once dry land could slowly have slipped below the waterline, year by year, century by century, until the streets and houses of Pavlopetri were finally claimed by the sea. But even if the reason for its disappearance can be explained, the discovery itself raises a much larger question. Because Pavlopetri proves something extraordinary. Ancient coastal settlements really can survive underwater. Entire towns can remain preserved beneath the sea for thousands of years. And if one city could survive like this, then it becomes impossible to ignore the possibility that others might exist as well. Hidden along drowned coastlines, buried beneath layers of sand, waiting for someone to find them. And in fact, archaeologists have already discovered another submerged city, one surrounded not by Mediterranean legends, but by ancient sacred texts. A city described thousands of years ago in one of the oldest epics ever written. For centuries, historians believed that story was only myth. But in the waters off the coast of India, divers may have found something that suggests the story could be real. Its name is Dwarka, and according to ancient tradition, it was built by a god. Discovering a submerged town is one thing. Proving that it truly existed as a functioning human settlement is another. Archaeologists cannot rely only on the shapes of ruins. Stone blocks and foundations may look convincing, but science demands stronger evidence. To understand what Pavlopetri really was, researchers needed to examine the details buried within the site. They needed proof of human life. Proof that people had once lived, worked, and built a community in this place before the sea claimed it. So the investigation continued beneath the water. Divers began a careful process of mapping the ruins. Working slowly across the seabed, they measured distances between structures and recorded the positions of walls, doorways, and streets. Over time, a remarkably clear map of the settlement began to emerge. What they found was extraordinary. Pavlopetri was not simply a cluster of buildings scattered randomly along the shore. It had a recognizable urban structure. The town covered an area of roughly 9 acres beneath the shallow Mediterranean water. Within that space, archaeologists identified dozens of individual buildings arranged in organized groups. Narrow streets ran between them, forming a network that connected different parts of the settlement. Some buildings appeared small and compact, likely the homes of ordinary families. Others were larger and more complex, with multiple rooms and internal divisions that suggested specialized use. One structure appeared to contain a large central hall. Another area seemed to include a courtyard surrounded by smaller rooms. These details mattered because they suggested that Pavlopetri was not a temporary camp or a simple fishing outpost. It was a real town, a place designed for long-term living. The layout of the streets also revealed something interesting. Many of them ran in straight lines, intersecting at angles that resembled a primitive grid pattern. This type of organized street planning usually appears only in societies that have developed a certain level of social coordination. Someone had designed this settlement. Someone had decided where the streets would run, where houses would be built, where people would gather. But the physical layout of the town was only part of the story. To understand who lived in Pavlopetri and when, they needed to examine the artifacts preserved within the site. Underwater excavation is delicate work. Divers must carefully remove layers of sediment without disturbing fragile objects hidden beneath the sand. Each artifact must be documented before it is moved, ensuring that its position within the site is accurately recorded. Over time, archaeologists recovered numerous objects from the seabed. Fragments of pottery were among the most important discoveries. Pottery styles change over time, and archaeologists often use them to estimate the age of ancient settlements. By comparing the shapes, decorations, and manufacturing techniques of ceramic fragments with those found at other archaeological sites, researchers can determine roughly when the objects were created. The pottery found near Pavlopetri matched styles associated with the Bronze Age. Some pieces appeared to come from storage jars used to hold food or liquids. Others may have been parts of everyday household containers. Stone tools were also discovered. These tools would have been used for basic tasks: cutting, shaping materials, preparing food, or performing small construction work within the settlement. Individually, these artifacts might not seem remarkable, but together they painted a clear picture. People had lived here. They had cooked meals, stored supplies, worked with tools, walked through the streets that now lay silent beneath the sea. And perhaps most importantly, the artifacts showed that Pavlopetri had once been connected to a wider world. Some pottery fragments suggested trade with other regions of the Mediterranean. That meant the people living in this coastal town were not isolated. They were part of a network. Goods, ideas, and technologies may have flowed between Pavlopetri and other settlements along the ancient coastline. In other words, Pavlopetri was not just a lonely town at the edge of the sea. It was part of a larger civilization. But one piece of evidence made the discovery even more fascinating. Because beneath the water, archaeologists also discovered something that almost never survives at ancient sites: burial structures. Graves that suggested generations of people had lived and died within this community. And that meant Pavlopetri was not simply a temporary settlement. It had been home. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence for any ancient settlement is not simply its buildings. It is the traces of human life left behind. And in Pavlopetri, those traces appear in surprising detail. As archaeologists continued to examine the site, they began to notice features that suggested the town had once supported a thriving community. The buildings were not crude shelters or temporary structures. Many of them showed clear signs of deliberate construction. Walls were built from carefully arranged stone blocks. Doorways connected interior rooms. In some places, the outlines of stairways could even be seen, suggesting that certain structures may have had upper levels before the sea claimed the city. The houses themselves varied in size. Some were relatively small, perhaps the homes of individual families. Others were larger and more complex, containing several rooms connected by interior passages. This variation hinted at something familiar to archaeologists studying ancient cities: social organization. In most long-lasting settlements, different types of buildings serve different purposes. Homes may vary depending on wealth or status. Certain structures may function as storage spaces, workshops, or communal gathering areas. The patterns observed in Pavlopetri suggest that the town may have been organized in exactly this way. But the most intriguing discoveries were not the buildings themselves. They were the spaces between them. Streets. Underwater mapping revealed that Pavlopetri possessed a network of roads connecting different sections of the settlement. These streets were narrow by modern standards, but their presence clearly showed that the town had been designed with movement in mind. People had walked these paths every day. Children may have played in the courtyards between houses. Merchants might have carried goods along the streets, trading with neighbors or preparing supplies for journeys along the coast. This was not simply a cluster of homes. It was a living community, another feature added to the growing evidence. At the edge of the settlement, archaeologists identified what appeared to be burial sites, graves. Burial structures are extremely important for archaeologists because they provide insight into how ancient societies viewed life and death. The presence of graves near Pavlopetri suggests that the people who lived here considered the area their permanent home. They were not simply visiting the coastline for seasonal fishing. They belonged to this place. Generations may have lived and died within the town. The discovery of graves also offered another important clue. Ancient communities often buried objects alongside the dead, items that might accompany a person into the afterlife. These artifacts can provide valuable information about the culture, technology, and beliefs of the people who once lived in a settlement. Although many materials do not survive well underwater, even small fragments can reveal important details. And the artifacts recovered from Pavlopetri continued to reinforce the same conclusion. This was a real town, a functioning coastal settlement connected to the broader world of the ancient Mediterranean. But modern technology would soon allow archaeologists to see Pavlopetri in a way that earlier explorers never could. In the early 21st century, a new research project began using advanced sonar scanning and digital mapping to record the entire site with extraordinary precision. Instead of relying only on divers swimming through the ruins, scientists used high-resolution imaging systems capable of creating three-dimensional models of the seabed. The results were remarkable. For the first time, the entire city of Pavlopetri could be reconstructed digitally. Streets, buildings, courtyards, every visible structure mapped in precise detail. When these models were assembled, archaeologists realized that the town was even more complex than they had originally believed. Dozens of buildings stretched across the seabed. Multiple streets intersected at different angles. The settlement had clearly grown over time as new structures were added. It was a real cityscape, frozen beneath the water for thousands of years. But this discovery led to another question. Because if Pavlopetri was once a thriving coastal town, something must have happened to it. Cities do not simply vanish. Communities do not abandon their homes without reason. Something changed, something powerful enough to transform a living settlement into a silent underwater ruin. And to understand that transformation, we need to examine how life once worked inside this ancient coastal town. To truly understand Pavlopetri, we have to imagine the city not as ruins beneath the sea, but as a living place. A town filled with movement, voices, daily routines that repeated themselves year after year. Thousands of years ago, long before the Mediterranean waves covered its streets, Pavlopetri stood on dry land beside a calm, natural harbor. The coastline looked very different then. The sea was slightly farther away, and the town sat safely along the edge of a shallow bay that protected boats from strong winds. For the people who lived there, the sea was not a threat. It was the center of their world. Fishing boats would have left the harbor early in the morning, heading out into deeper waters in search of fish and shellfish. The Mediterranean was rich with marine life, and coastal communities often depended on it as a primary food source. But fishing was only one part of life in the town. Archaeologists believe Pavlopetri may have been an important coastal trading settlement. Its position along the southern coast of Greece placed it directly along ancient maritime routes that connected communities throughout the Aegean Sea. Long before the rise of classical Greek civilization, small boats traveled between islands and coastal towns, exchanging goods, tools, and materials. Pavlopetri may have served as one of these stops along the ancient trade network. Boats arriving from neighboring settlements might have carried pottery, metals, fabrics, or food supplies. In return, local merchants could have traded fish, agricultural products, or crafted goods produced by the town's residents. Evidence from other Bronze Age settlements suggests that even relatively small coastal towns often played a role in regional trade. And Pavlopetri's harbor would have made it an ideal location for exactly this type of activity. Imagine the scene. Small wooden boats approaching the shoreline, sails lowered as they entered the calm waters of the bay. Merchants stepping onto the beach with baskets of goods, fishermen returning with their catch after hours at sea. Life in the town would have followed rhythms tied closely to the natural environment. Morning activity near the harbor, midday work in workshops or homes, evening gatherings in courtyards or open spaces as the heat of the Mediterranean sun began to fade. Inside the houses, families cooked meals over small fires. Clay vessels stored grain, oil, and water. Tools were used to repair fishing nets, shape wooden objects, or prepare materials for daily use. Children grew up learning the same skills their parents had practiced for generations: navigation, fishing, trade, construction, knowledge of winds and currents. These skills were essential for coastal communities whose survival depended on understanding the sea. And the layout of Pavlopetri itself suggests that the town had developed over time as these activities expanded. Buildings were placed close together, creating neighborhoods where families likely lived side by side. The narrow streets allowed people to move easily through the settlement, connecting homes to the harbor and to other parts of the town. Certain structures appear to have been larger than ordinary houses. These may have served special purposes: storage buildings, workshops, perhaps even communal gathering places where decisions affecting the town were discussed. Although we cannot know every detail of daily life in Pavlopetri, the archaeological evidence allows us to reconstruct a picture that feels surprisingly familiar. A working harbor town, a place where people lived close to the sea and depended on it for survival. A community built around cooperation, trade, and shared knowledge of the coastal environment. But there is one detail about Pavlopetri that makes the story even more interesting. Because this town was not isolated. It existed within a wider world of Bronze Age societies that were slowly becoming more connected through maritime travel. Across the Aegean Sea, other coastal settlements were growing. New trade routes were forming. Ideas and technologies were spreading between communities. And Pavlopetri may have been part of that network. But if that was true, then the city's story becomes even more mysterious. Because towns connected to trade networks usually grow stronger over time. They expand, they prosper, they attract more people. Yet Pavlopetri did not grow into a great city. Instead, something happened that caused it to disappear beneath the sea. And the forces that destroyed it may have been far more powerful than anyone living there could have imagined. If Pavlopetri functioned as a coastal trading town, then its harbor would have been the most important part of the settlement. Everything in the town likely revolved around that small stretch of shoreline. In the ancient Mediterranean, the sea was not a barrier between cultures, it was a highway. Long before large ships crossed oceans, small wooden vessels were already traveling between islands and coastlines. These boats were simple by modern standards, but they were perfectly suited for short voyages along protected waters. A sailor could follow the coastline, navigating by landmarks, winds, and currents that experienced mariners understood well. For coastal settlements like Pavlopetri, this created opportunities. Communities that controlled safe harbors often became small centers of trade. Boats traveling between regions needed places to stop, places to repair equipment, rest crews, exchange goods, and gather information about conditions farther along the coast. Pavlopetri's position in the southern Peloponnese would have placed it directly along these maritime routes. Ships moving through the Aegean Sea could pass nearby while traveling between the Greek mainland, the islands of the Mediterranean, and even farther regions connected through early trade networks. When vessels approached the harbor, the town would have come alive. Fishermen pulling boats onto the shore, merchants preparing goods for exchange, residents gathering along the waterfront to watch the arrival of visitors from distant communities. Goods may have changed hands on the beach itself, clay jars filled with olive oil, bundles of dried fish, stone tools or metal objects produced by craftsmen in other settlements. Even small quantities of exotic materials might have arrived through these networks. Amber from distant northern lands, rare stones used for jewelry or decoration, perhaps early forms of bronze tools that were beginning to spread across the Mediterranean world. Trade did not only move objects, it also moved ideas. Technological knowledge could spread along these routes. New methods of building boats, crafting tools, or organizing communities could pass from one coastal town to another through the interactions of sailors and merchants. Over time, this exchange helped connect scattered settlements into larger cultural networks. Pavlopetri may have been one small piece of that growing system. Its harbor allowed people to move between regions. Its streets organized the life of the town. Its houses sheltered families who depended on the rhythms of the sea. But like every coastal community, the people of Pavlopetri would have lived with an awareness of the ocean's power. The sea provided food and trade, yet it could also bring storms. Strong winds could turn calm water into violent waves. Seasonal weather patterns could change conditions dramatically in a matter of hours. Ancient sailors respected these dangers. Communities along the Mediterranean developed knowledge of storms, tides, and coastal geography that helped them survive in a sometimes unpredictable environment. Even so, there were forces beyond anyone's control. The land itself could move. The region surrounding southern Greece sits along tectonic boundaries where earthquakes have occurred for thousands of years. When the earth shifts beneath the sea, coastlines can change suddenly. A harbor that once stood safely above the waterline can sink. Entire sections of land can tilt or collapse. Combined with the slow but steady rise of sea levels after the Ice Age, these geological forces could gradually transform a coastline. What was once dry land might slowly become marshy shoreline. What was once shoreline might eventually slip beneath the waves. For the people of Pavlopetri, these changes may not have seemed dramatic at first. A little more water each year, a shoreline creeping closer to the town, perhaps storms that seemed stronger than those remembered by older generations. But over centuries, those small changes could accumulate. Harbor waters could become deeper. Flooding might reach buildings that once stood safely inland. Eventually, parts of the settlement may have become impossible to live in. And once that process began, the future of the town may have been sealed. Because coastal settlements depend entirely on the stability of the land beneath them. When that land changes, everything changes with it. Yet even if Pavlopetri slowly disappeared beneath the sea, the story of this city raises an even larger question. Because Pavlopetri was not the only coastal settlement built during the ancient world. Across the Mediterranean, and across the entire planet, countless communities once stood along shorelines that no longer exist. If one town could vanish beneath the ocean, how many others might have disappeared the same way? And when archaeologists began searching the world's coastlines more carefully, they started to realize something remarkable. Pavlopetri might only be a small example of a much larger pattern. At first glance, Pavlopetri might seem like a small and isolated discovery. A single town lying quietly beneath the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. An archaeological curiosity, interesting, but perhaps not revolutionary. But discoveries in science rarely remain isolated for long. Once researchers confirmed that an ancient coastal settlement could survive beneath the sea for thousands of years, a new possibility began to emerge. What if Pavlopetri was not unique? What if it was only the first example of something much larger? Because if rising sea levels had submerged one coastal town, there was no reason to believe it had spared the countless other communities that once stood along ancient shorelines. The end of the Ice Age did not affect only Greece. It reshaped the entire planet. As glaciers melted, the oceans rose steadily across every coastline on Earth. The sea advanced inland year after year, century after century. Low plains flooded, river mouths expanded into bays. Entire coastal landscapes disappeared beneath the water, and along those ancient coastlines people had lived. Archaeologists have long known that early human communities favored coastal environments. Access to fishing, trade routes, and stable climates made these regions ideal for settlement. But if those coastlines now lie beneath the ocean, then an enormous portion of early human history may be hidden there as well. For centuries, that possibility remained mostly theoretical. Exploring the seabed was simply too difficult. Even today, the oceans remain one of the least explored parts of our planet. But over the past few decades, technology has changed dramatically. New sonar systems can map the ocean floor with astonishing precision. High-resolution imaging allows researchers to detect structures buried beneath layers of sediment. Autonomous underwater vehicles can scan large areas that divers cannot safely reach. And as these technologies have expanded, researchers have begun to discover something remarkable. Pavlopetri is not alone. Across the world's oceans, scientists are finding more and more evidence of submerged landscapes where people once lived. Ancient river channels carved into the seabed, submerged forests whose trees still stand upright beneath the water, stone tools recovered from drowned plains, and in some places, something even more extraordinary, the remains of settlements. Evidence that ancient communities once stood on land that has long since vanished beneath the sea. In northern Europe, fishermen working in the North Sea have occasionally pulled up strange objects in their nets. Stone tools shaped by human hands, bones of animals that roamed the Ice Age plains, even fragments of human remains. These discoveries suggest that the seabed between Britain and mainland Europe was once a vast inhabited landscape, a region now known as Doggerland. In Southeast Asia, geological research has revealed that many of today's islands were once connected by an enormous landmass that stretched across the region. During the Ice Age, this landscape formed a huge tropical continent where humans could move freely between what are now separate islands. Today, much of that land lies beneath the waters of the South China Sea and the surrounding oceans. Researchers call this lost world Sundaland, and these are only two examples. Around the world, evidence continues to accumulate that ancient coastlines once supported human populations in places that are now underwater. The implications of this idea are enormous. If entire regions once existed where oceans now lie, then the archaeological record we study today represents only a fragment of the ancient world. The ruins we find on land may be the surviving pieces of a much larger puzzle. But the most fascinating discoveries are not just drowned landscapes. They are the submerged cities themselves. Because if Pavlopetri proved that ancient towns could survive underwater, then the next question becomes unavoidable. How many other cities are still hidden beneath the sea? And in some parts of the world, archaeologists may have already found another answer to that question. Far from the Mediterranean, along the western coast of India, divers exploring the seabed encountered something that seemed almost impossible. Stone walls, large structures, and a settlement described thousands of years ago in one of the oldest stories ever written. A city known as Dwarka. When archaeologists began to realize that Pavlopetri was not an isolated case, a new and unsettling idea started to take shape. If ancient coastal towns could be preserved beneath shallow water in Greece, then similar sites might exist along countless other drowned coastlines around the world. And the more researchers looked, the more evidence they began to find. The problem is scale. The oceans cover more than 70% of our planet, and the continental shelves, those shallow underwater regions that were once dry land during the Ice Age, stretch across enormous areas. These submerged plains are vast. In many places, they extend hundreds of kilometers from modern coastlines before dropping into the deep ocean. For most of human history, these areas were impossible to explore. Divers could only search small sections near shore. Even today, underwater exploration remains expensive and technically difficult. But modern mapping technology has changed that. Using advanced sonar imaging, scientists can now scan large sections of the seabed and detect shapes that may indicate ancient landscapes. Sometimes those scans reveal the outlines of drowned rivers, ancient channels that once carried water across land that is now buried beneath the sea. In other cases, researchers have discovered submerged forests, tree stumps preserved underwater where entire woodlands once grew before rising oceans drowned them. These discoveries prove something important. The landscapes that existed during the Ice Age were not small coastal strips. They were enormous regions, capable of supporting large human populations. And if people lived there, it is reasonable to assume that settlements existed as well. Villages, trading posts, perhaps even cities. In Northern Europe, geological studies have revealed one of the most dramatic examples of these lost landscapes. During the Ice Age, the region between modern Britain and mainland Europe was not covered by water. Instead, it formed a vast plain of grasslands, rivers, and wetlands that stretched across what is now the North Sea. Animals such as mammoths and giant deer once roamed across this landscape, and humans lived there too. Stone tools recovered by fishermen along with bones and other artifacts suggest that thousands of people once inhabited this region. Today, archaeologists refer to this lost land as Doggerland. It was not a small island. It was a massive territory connecting entire regions of Europe. But as the Ice Age ended and glaciers melted, the sea slowly advanced across the plains. Over thousands of years, Doggerland disappeared beneath the rising waters of the North Sea. And with it, vanished the traces of the communities that had once lived there. The same pattern appears in other parts of the world. In Southeast Asia, geological evidence shows that many of today's islands were once part of a single enormous landmass. During the Ice Age, regions that are now separated by ocean formed a continuous landscape of tropical forests, rivers, and coastal plains. This lost continent, known as Sundaland, may have supported large human populations long before the rise of recorded civilizations. But as global temperatures warmed, rising seas gradually flooded these regions as well. Entire landscapes vanished beneath the water, and with them disappeared the settlements that once stood there. These discoveries reveal something extraordinary. The ancient world may have been far larger than we imagine. The civilizations we study today, those preserved on land, may represent only the surviving fragments of a much bigger human story. Much of that story now lies beneath the ocean, hidden across drowned plains and submerged coastlines. And occasionally, when divers or researchers explore these regions, they find something that challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient history. Because sometimes, the structures discovered underwater are not just villages. They are cities, large settlements with walls, harbors, and organized architecture. And one of the most intriguing examples lies far from the Mediterranean, along the western coast of India. There, beneath the waters of the Arabian Sea, divers have found stone structures that appear to match the description of a city mentioned in one of the oldest epic texts in human history. A city that ancient tradition claimed was swallowed by the ocean in a single day. For centuries, historians believed that story was only legend. But what archaeologists began to discover beneath those waters would make the legend far more difficult to dismiss. The name of that city is Dwarka, For thousands of years, the story of Dwarka was known only from ancient texts. In the epic Indian scripture known as the Mahabharata, Dwarka is described as a magnificent city built along the western coast of India. According to tradition, it was the legendary kingdom of Krishna, one of the most revered figures in Hindu mythology. The text describes Dwarka as a great coastal city filled with palaces, temples, and fortified walls. It was said to be prosperous and powerful, connected to the sea through harbors that allowed ships to travel between distant lands. But the story of Dwarka does not end with its prosperity. According to the Mahabharata, after Krishna's death, the sea itself rose and swallowed the city. The text describes the moment dramatically. Waves crashing against the walls, water flooding the streets, the entire city disappearing beneath the ocean. For centuries, historians treated this story the same way they treated many other ancient legends, as myth. Ancient cultures often described floods, lost cities, and divine punishment. These stories were usually interpreted as symbolic narratives rather than historical records. The idea that an entire city mentioned in a religious epic might actually lie beneath the sea seemed unlikely. But as underwater exploration expanded during the 20th century, researchers began to wonder whether the coastline described in the ancient text might contain real archaeological remains. Because the location of Dwarka in the Mahabharata is not vague, the epic places the city along the coast of the modern Indian state of Gujarat, and that coastline has been studied extensively. Over thousands of years, the Arabian Sea has reshaped the shoreline again and again. Rising sea levels, coastal erosion, and shifting sediment have transformed the landscape. Which means that if an ancient city had once existed there, it might now lie beneath the water. In the late 20th century, marine archaeologists began investigating this possibility. Teams from India's National Institute of Oceanography started exploring the seabed near the modern city of Dwarka, using diving equipment and sonar imaging to search for submerged structures. What they found surprised everyone. Beneath the waters of the Arabian Sea, divers began to identify stone formations that did not appear to be natural. Large blocks arranged in lines, structures that resembled walls, patterns suggesting foundations of buildings. At first, the discoveries were tentative. Underwater archaeology is complex, and natural rock formations can sometimes create shapes that resemble human construction. But the deeper the researchers explored, the more intriguing the site became. Artifacts began to appear. Fragments of pottery, stone anchors, objects that suggested ancient maritime activity. And gradually, a picture began to emerge. It appeared that an ancient settlement may indeed have existed along this coastline, one that had eventually been submerged beneath the sea. But if that was true, the implications were extraordinary. Because the Mahabharata was written thousands of years ago, if the text had accurately described a real coastal city that later disappeared beneath the ocean, it would mean that one of humanity's oldest epic stories might contain a memory of an actual historical place. A city that had once stood on land. A city that had later vanished beneath the waves. But the most controversial question had yet to be answered. How old was it? Because if the dating of the underwater structures proved correct, the city of Dwarka might be far older than anyone expected, and that possibility would ignite one of the most heated debates in modern archaeology. Determining the age of an underwater site is never simple. Unlike ruins found on dry land, submerged settlements are often disturbed by ocean currents, shifting sediment, and centuries of geological change. Objects can move. Layers of sand can bury or reveal artifacts over time. For archaeologists studying Dwarka, establishing a reliable timeline became one of the most difficult challenges. But some discoveries offered valuable clues. Divers exploring the seabed recovered stone anchors, large triangular blocks carved with holes that would have once held ropes used to secure ships. These anchors were similar to others found at ancient ports across the Indian Ocean. Their presence suggested that the settlement had once functioned as a harbor. Ships had arrived there, trade had taken place, people had lived beside the sea. Pottery fragments were also discovered in the surrounding sediment. Like the ceramics found near Pavlopetri, these fragments allowed archaeologists to compare styles and techniques with other known sites. Some of the artifacts appeared to belong to the Bronze Age, but other discoveries complicated the story. During sonar surveys conducted in the nearby Gulf of Khambhat, researchers identified large geometric shapes beneath the seabed, patterns that some scientists interpreted as the remains of a much older settlement buried deeper under the water. When samples of wood and other organic material recovered from the area were analyzed using radiocarbon dating, some results suggested an age of nearly 9,000 years. If those results were correct, the implications would be astonishing. A settlement that old would predate the earliest known cities of Mesopotamia by thousands of years. It would exist long before the rise of Egypt's pyramids, long before what most historians consider the beginning of civilization. But not all researchers agree with these interpretations. Many archaeologists argue that the dating results from the Gulf of Khambhat may not necessarily correspond to the structures identified by sonar. Organic materials can drift from one location to another before becoming buried in sediment, making it difficult to link them directly to specific ruins. Others point out that underwater imaging can sometimes create patterns that appear artificial but are actually produced by natural geological processes. In other words, the evidence remains controversial. Some researchers believe the underwater structures near Dwarka represent the remains of an ancient port city that gradually sank beneath the sea. Others remain cautious, arguing that more excavation and direct evidence are needed before such conclusions can be confirmed. This debate has continued for decades, and it reflects a broader challenge within archaeology itself. The oceans still hide enormous portions of the ancient world. Most underwater sites remain unexplored, and even when discoveries are made, interpreting them can take years or even generations of study. Yet despite the uncertainty, the discoveries near Dwarka have forced historians to reconsider something important. Ancient texts sometimes preserve fragments of real history. Stories passed down through generations may contain memories of places that once existed but later disappeared. A city lost beneath the sea, a harbor swallowed by rising waters, a settlement abandoned as the shoreline changed. Whether the legendary Dwarka described in the Mahabharata is identical to the ruins discovered underwater remains a subject of debate. But one fact is becoming increasingly clear. The oceans have hidden far more of humanity's past than we once believed. And in some places, the mysteries become even stranger, because not every underwater structure looks like the ruins of a city. Some look like something else entirely. Massive stone formations, perfect angles, steps carved into rock beneath the sea. Structures so unusual that even geologists cannot fully agree on how they were formed. And one of the most famous examples lies off the southern coast of Japan, a place where divers discovered something that looks almost like a giant underwater pyramid. The structure is known as Yonaguni, and to this day, scientists still argue about whether it was built by nature or by human hands. In the waters off the southern coast of Japan lies one of the most unusual underwater discoveries ever recorded. Unlike Pavlopetri or the possible ruins near Dwarka, this structure does not immediately resemble a traditional city. There are no obvious houses, no clear streets, no pottery scattered across the seabed. Instead, what divers see when they descend into the water near the island of Yonaguni is something far more puzzling. A massive stone formation rising from the ocean floor. At first glance, it looks almost architectural. Huge, flat terraces step downward like enormous staircases carved directly into the rock. Long, straight edges run across the structure, forming sharp corners that appear strangely precise. Some sections look like platforms, others resemble walls, and the entire formation stretches across an area large enough to resemble a monumental building complex. The discovery was made in 1987 by a local diver named Kihachiro Aratake. Aratake was searching the waters around Yonaguni for new diving locations where visitors could observe schools of hammerhead sharks that frequently gather in the region. While exploring the seabed near the island, he noticed something unexpected: large stone surfaces arranged in shapes that seemed unusually regular. Curious, he returned several times to examine the site more closely. Each visit revealed more details: terraces descending in layers, sharp edges that appeared almost perfectly straight, large blocks of rock forming geometric patterns across the seabed. When photographs of the formation began to circulate, the discovery quickly attracted attention. Some observers immediately noticed something striking. The structure looked remarkably similar to step pyramids found in ancient civilizations on land. Large horizontal platforms stacked one above another, wide, stair-like surfaces descending toward the seabed, vertical walls rising between levels. From certain angles, the formation almost appears as if it had been carved intentionally. Naturally, this sparked debate. If the structure were artificial, it could represent one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries ever made. But if it were natural, it would still be one of the most unusual geological formations found beneath the ocean. Researchers soon began visiting Yonaguni to examine the site firsthand. One of the most well-known investigators was Professor Masaki Kimura from the University of the Ryukyus in Okinawa. After years of studying the formation, Kimura proposed a controversial idea. He believed the structure might have been shaped by human activity. According to Kimura, some of the features visible at Yonaguni, particularly the straight edges and stepped terraces, resembled construction techniques seen in ancient architecture. He suggested that the formation might once have been part of a larger structure built when the area was still above sea level. If that were true, the structure could be incredibly old. Because the sea around Yonaguni did not reach its current level until roughly 10,000 years ago, at the end of the Ice Age. That would mean the structure had to be older than that, possibly far older than any known civilization capable of building such massive stone constructions. But many geologists strongly disagreed with this interpretation. They argued that the Yonaguni structure is the result of natural processes. The region's sandstone layers fracture along straight lines when subjected to tectonic pressure and erosion. Over time, these fractures can create flat surfaces and sharp angles that resemble artificial architecture. In other words, nature itself might have carved the terraces and edges that appear so mysterious. The debate quickly became one of the most famous controversies in underwater archaeology. Two competing explanations, one suggesting ancient human construction, the other pointing to powerful geological forces shaping the rock over thousands of years. And even today, decades after its discovery, scientists remain divided. But there is one detail about Yonaguni that makes the mystery even deeper. Because if the structure was once above water during the Ice Age, then the surrounding landscape must have been dry land as well, which raises an intriguing possibility. If humans were living in that region at the time, what else might have existed there? The debate surrounding the Yonaguni structure has continued for decades. Each year, divers, geologists, and archaeologists return to the site hoping to answer the same question. Is this formation natural, or was it shaped by human hands? Supporters of the natural explanation point to the geological history of the region. The rock around Yonaguni is primarily sandstone, a material known for breaking along straight lines when exposed to tectonic pressure. Over thousands of years, earthquakes and erosion can create flat surfaces and sharp edges that appear surprisingly geometric. In coastal environments, strong ocean currents can gradually remove softer material, leaving behind stepped terraces and angular formations. To geologists, these processes are capable of producing shapes that may look artificial at first glance. From this perspective, the Yonaguni structure could simply be an extraordinary natural formation created by the interaction of rock layers, tectonic movement, and ocean erosion. But not everyone is convinced. Researchers who support the artificial hypothesis point to details that seem difficult to explain through natural processes alone. Some surfaces appear unusually smooth, Certain angles are remarkably precise. In a few places, features resemble stairways or pathways connecting different levels of the structure. There are also reports of what appear to be carved symbols on nearby stones, though these interpretations remain highly controversial. For those who believe the structure may have been modified by humans, these details suggest that Yonaguni might once have been part of a much larger complex, perhaps a ceremonial site. Perhaps the foundation of a structure built when the land stood above sea level. If that were true, it would mean that humans living in the region thousands of years ago possessed the ability to shape large stone formations. And that possibility raises an even bigger question. Because the sea around Yonaguni did not flood its current coastline until roughly 10,000 years ago, during the last ice age, sea levels were dramatically lower. Large areas that are now underwater were once exposed land. If the Yonaguni structure existed above sea level during that time, it would have been part of a much larger landscape, a coastline that stretched far beyond the modern island. And if humans were living along that ancient coastline, they may have built settlements across the surrounding plains. But today, those plains are gone. They lie beneath the waters of the East China Sea, just like the drowned landscapes of Doggerland in Europe, just like the submerged regions of Sundaland in Southeast Asia, just like the ancient coastal towns now hidden beneath Mediterranean waters. These discoveries suggest that the story of underwater ruins is not confined to one region of the world. It is global. Across continents and oceans, the same pattern keeps appearing. Ancient coastlines that once supported human communities. Landscapes that were gradually flooded as sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, and occasionally remnants of settlements that survived beneath the water long enough to be rediscovered thousands of years later. But even with these discoveries, one question remains unanswered. Were these underwater sites simply isolated coastal towns? Or could they represent the fragments of something larger, a network of ancient civilizations that once existed along coastlines that no longer exist today? Some researchers believe the idea is unlikely. Others believe the evidence is slowly pointing in that direction. And in recent decades, one writer in particular has brought this possibility into the global conversation. For more than 30 years, he has argued that human civilization may be far older than traditional history suggests. That ancient societies could have existed before the end of the Ice Age, and that the rising seas may have erased much of the evidence. His name is Graham Hancock, and his theory has sparked one of the most controversial debates in modern archaeology. For most of the modern age, the timeline of civilization appeared relatively stable. According to the standard historical model, complex urban society began around 6,000 years ago. In places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and later the Indus Valley, humans developed the first true cities, organized governments, monumental architecture, and writing systems that allowed history to be recorded in lasting form. Before that point, the story seemed much simpler. Human communities certainly existed, but they were generally believed to be small, scattered, and comparatively limited in scale. Hunter-gatherers gradually became farmers. Villages slowly formed. Agriculture produced surpluses, populations increased, and only after a long period of development did civilization finally emerge. It is a tidy story, a logical story, and for a long time it appeared to fit the evidence. But there is one major problem with that picture. It is based almost entirely on what survived above sea level. The ruins that archaeologists study are the ruins that remained on land. The cities we excavate are the cities that were not swallowed by the sea. The settlements that shaped our understanding of early civilization are the settlements that happened, by chance or geography, to remain visible in the modern world. But what if that surviving record is incomplete? What if entire coastlines, where humans had lived for thousands of years, now lie beneath the ocean? What if some of the most important early settlements were built in precisely the locations most vulnerable to flooding at the end of the Ice Age? That possibility changes everything. Because throughout history, humans have always favored water. Rivers, lakes, and coastlines offered food, transportation, fertile land, and trade routes. Again and again, the earliest major settlements appeared beside water because that is where life was easiest to sustain and where exchange between communities could grow. Which means the places where early societies were most likely to flourish are also the places most likely to be underwater today. That idea has slowly reshaped one of the most important debates in archaeology, and few writers have pushed that debate into public view more aggressively than Graham Hancock. In 1995, Hancock published Fingerprints of the Gods, a book that argued for a possibility mainstream archaeology had largely rejected, that a sophisticated civilization may have existed before the end of the last ice age, and that much of its physical evidence may have been destroyed by floods, sea level rise, and catastrophic environmental change. According to Hancock's theory, the end of the Ice Age was not simply a slow transition from one climate period to another. It was a time of upheaval. Coastlines changed dramatically. Temperatures shifted. The natural world was destabilized. If complex human societies had already begun to form along ancient shorelines, they may have been devastated when the seas rose and drowned the lands they occupied. To many archaeologists, this theory went far beyond the available evidence. Critics argued that Hancock was drawing conclusions that the archaeological record could not support. They pointed out that no confirmed Ice Age city had yet been excavated in a way that proved the existence of a lost global civilization. They accused him of combining real discoveries with speculative leaps that blurred the boundary between research and storytelling. And yet, despite the criticism, Hancock's ideas found a huge audience. Part of the reason is simple. He was asking questions that many people were already beginning to ask on their own. How much of the human past has been lost? How many ancient coastlines have vanished? And if the sea covered the very regions where people were most likely to build, how can we be sure that the earliest chapters of civilization have not simply disappeared from view? Those questions became even more difficult to dismiss as new discoveries emerged. One of the most important was Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Dating back more than 11,000 years, Göbekli Tepe contains monumental stone pillars carved with animals and arranged in carefully planned enclosure. The site appears to have been built by people living long before the rise of cities and long before agriculture was thought to have fully transformed human society. Göbekli Tepe did not prove Hancock's theory, but it did prove something equally important. The old assumptions were incomplete. Humans more than 10,000 years ago were capable of organized labor, symbolic architecture, and large-scale construction on a level many scholars once thought impossible for that period. And if one major assumption about early civilization had to be revised, then perhaps others might have to change as well. That is where underwater discoveries become so important. Pavlopetri demonstrates that a real town can survive beneath the sea. Dwarka suggests that ancient texts may preserve memories of places later swallowed by water. Yonaguni, whether natural or artificial, forces scientists to confront just how much of the ancient landscape now lies underwater and how difficult it can be to interpret what remains. Taken together, these sites do not prove the existence of a vanished global supercivilization, but they do reveal something much more solid. The prehistoric and early ancient world was larger than the one preserved in our textbooks. A great deal of human history may now rest beneath the waves. And if that is true, then the most important archaeological discoveries of the future may not come from deserts or jungles. They may come from the ocean floor. The possibility that parts of early civilization may now lie beneath the ocean raises an unsettling thought. If ancient cities existed along coastlines that no longer exist, then the archaeological record we rely on today may only represent the survivors of a much larger story. Imagine trying to reconstruct the history of a modern civilization thousands of years in the future, after most of its coastal cities had vanished beneath the sea. The surviving ruins might show a handful of inland settlements, but many of the world's most important cities, New York, Tokyo, Shanghai, London, would be gone. Future archaeologists studying the fragments that remained might draw conclusions that only captured part of the picture. Something similar may have happened with our own past. The cities we know today, Uruk, Memphis, Mohenjo-daro, are the ones that remained visible after thousands of years of environmental change. But they may not have been the only ones. They may simply be the ones that survived. This idea has led some researchers to revisit one of the most famous legends in human history, the story of Atlantis. The only detailed description of Atlantis comes from the Greek philosopher Plato, writing around 360 BCE in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias. According to Plato, Atlantis was once a powerful island civilization located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. Plato described it as a wealthy maritime power with advanced architecture, large harbors, and an organized society. But the story takes a dramatic turn. In Plato's account, Atlantis fell out of harmony with the natural order, and then, in a single catastrophic event, the island was destroyed. Earthquakes and floods struck, the land sank beneath the sea, and the once great civilization disappeared beneath the ocean. For more than 2,000 years, historians have debated whether Plato intended the story as history or allegory. Some scholars believe Atlantis was simply a philosophical metaphor, a cautionary tale about hubris and the dangers of power. Others have wondered whether the story might preserve a distant cultural memory of real events. After all, flood legends appear in cultures all over the world. Stories of cities swallowed by water. Stories of lands lost to rising seas. Stories of entire communities forced to flee as coastlines disappeared. These stories could simply be myths created independently by different societies, but they might also reflect a shared human experience. Because the end of the Ice Age truly did transform the world's coastlines. Between roughly 15,000 and 6,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Entire landscapes vanished. Ancient plains became seabeds, and the shorelines that people once called home were slowly drowned. If early settlements existed in those regions, many of them would have disappeared as well. That does not mean Atlantis was real, but it does suggest that the idea of cities lost beneath the sea is not purely fictional. We now know that coastal settlements can vanish. Pavlopetri proves it. Other submerged landscapes around the world reinforce the same pattern, and every year, new underwater surveys reveal more traces of drowned terrain that once supported human life. The truth may lie somewhere between myth and science. Perhaps the legends exaggerate the scale of what was lost, or perhaps they preserve faint memories of real events that occurred thousands of years before written history began. What is certain is that the oceans still hold many unanswered questions. We have explored only a small portion of the seabed. Vast areas of the continental shelves remain largely unmapped, and within those submerged landscapes may lie ruins that could change our understanding of the human past. The search has only just begun. But the most unsettling realization may not be about ancient history at all, because the same force that swallowed those ancient coastlines is still shaping the world today. The sea is still rising. For thousands of years, the ruins beneath the ocean have felt like relics from a distant and unreachable past. Cities swallowed by rising seas, entire landscapes erased by water, civilizations reduced to broken walls on the seabed, and fragments of stone hidden beneath layers of sediment. When we look at places like Pavlopetri, the possible ruins near Dwarka, the drowned plains of Doggerland, or the lost continent of Sundaland, it is easy to believe their stories belong to another age, an ancient world governed by forces far removed from our own. But the deeper scientists study the history of the oceans, the more uncomfortable one realization becomes. The forces that drowned those ancient worlds did not disappear. They are still here. And in many ways, they have already begun again. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, the planet entered one of the greatest environmental transitions in human history. Massive glaciers that had covered huge regions of the northern hemisphere began to melt. As the climate warmed, unimaginable quantities of frozen water were released into the oceans. Over thousands of years, global sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Coastlines moved inland. River valleys became bays. Great plains that had once supported human life disappeared beneath expanding seas. For the people living through that transformation, the change may not have looked like a single dramatic catastrophe. At first, it may have felt almost invisible. A shoreline retreating a little farther each generation. A fishing ground becoming deeper. Salt water creeping into fields that once grew food. A familiar beach turning into a marsh, then a bay, and finally, open sea. And that is what makes this story so unsettling. The destruction of an entire world does not always arrive in one violent moment. Sometimes it comes slowly enough that those living through it do not fully realize what is happening until it is too late. Generation by generation, the land shrinks. Generation by generation, the sea advances. And by the time the process is complete, an entire landscape has vanished. For a long time, it was comforting to imagine that such events belonged only to the distant past. Ancient people lacked the technology to predict long-term environmental change. They had no satellites, no climate models, no global data. They lived at the mercy of forces they could not understand. Modern civilization, by contrast, appears powerful, organized, and technologically advanced. We monitor polar ice from space. We measure every millimeter of sea level rise. We build seawalls, pumps, and flood barriers. We forecast storms days in advance. Compared with the small coastal societies of prehistory, our world seems almost invulnerable. And yet the ocean does not care how advanced a civilization believes itself to be. Water follows gravity. Ice melts. Coastlines change. And the measurements being recorded today tell a story that is becoming harder to ignore. Over the past century, global sea levels have risen by more than 20 centimeters. On paper, that number may seem modest, but spread across the vast coastlines of the world, it represents an extraordinary transformation already in motion. More importantly, the rate of rise is increasing. Satellite observations show that the oceans are now rising faster than they were just decades ago. Greenland is losing ice. Antarctica is losing ice. Mountain glaciers across the planet are shrinking. At the same time, warmer ocean water expands, adding still more volume to the seas. In geological terms, the process remains gradual. In human terms, it is happening fast. And that is where the past suddenly begins to feel less distant. Because the places most vulnerable today are not random places. They are the same kinds of places humans have always chosen. Natural harbors, river deltas, coastal plains, low shorelines beside the sea. The same environments that once made Pavlopetri possible now support some of the largest cities on Earth. New York, Miami, Shanghai, Amsterdam, Bangkok, Jakarta, Alexandria, Lagos. These cities became great because the coast gave them power. Access to trade routes, access to ships and global exchange, access to fertile land, transportation, and economic growth. For thousands of years, the sea has made civilizations rich, but it also makes them fragile. Many of the world's largest urban centers stand only a few meters above present sea level. Some are built on river mouths where storm surges can push far inland. Others rest on reclaimed land or soft ground that is slowly subsiding even as the ocean rises around them. In some places, the threat does not arrive only from above with waves and storms. It rises from below. In Miami, salt water pushes inland through porous limestone beneath the city. Streets flood during unusually high tides, even on calm, sunny days. In Jakarta, entire districts are sinking as groundwater extraction lowers the land faster than defenses can be built. In parts of New York, infrastructure designed for the shoreline of the past now faces a future in which storm surges may become far more destructive. And this is where the ancient world begins to look less like a mystery and more like a warning. Because the people of Doggerland did not know they were standing inside a story that would one day be told as prehistory. The people of Pavlopetri did not know that divers, thousands of years later, would swim through their streets. The people who may have lived along the drowned coasts of India and Southeast Asia did not know their homes would become legends, myths, and disputed archaeological sites. To them, those places were not mysteries. They were simply home. And home was changing, slowly, relentlessly, possibly beyond their ability to stop it. That may be the most haunting lesson hidden inside every underwater ruin we have explored. Not that ancient people were foolish, not that they failed to predict the future, but that even a functioning, organized, intelligent society can be overtaken by environmental change when that change unfolds across generations. And if that was true then, the question becomes impossible to avoid now. What will future generations inherit from us if the sea continues to rise? What coastlines will survive? What cities will adapt? And which of our own great urban centers might one day rest beneath the water, waiting for divers not yet born to discover them? But the strangest part of this story is not what we may lose. It is how familiar the pattern already seems. History has a strange way of repeating itself, not always in the exact same form, but often in patterns that echo across centuries. Civilizations rise near rivers and coastlines because water brings life, trade, and prosperity. Cities grow, populations expand, and what were once small settlements become global centers of culture and power. And then, sometimes, the very force that helped create them becomes the force that threatens them. When archaeologists first began discovering cities beneath the sea, many of those places seemed almost unbelievable. Entire streets preserved underwater, stone houses resting quietly on the seabed, harbor structures that once held ships now surrounded by fish and coral. To modern observers, these places appear mysterious, almost mythical, remnants of a forgotten chapter of human history. But to the people who lived there, nothing about their cities was mysterious. They built them. They walked those streets. They raised families beside those shores. They watched ships arrive from distant lands carrying goods, stories, and travelers. Those cities were not legends. They were ordinary places filled with ordinary lives. Until the water came. Sometimes the change may have felt slow enough to ignore. A shoreline shifting slightly farther inland, storm tides reaching a little higher each decade, fields becoming harder to farm as salt water crept into the soil. But sometimes the change may have been sudden. Storm surges, earthquakes, tsunamis, moments when nature moved faster than anyone could prepare for. When we imagine those ancient catastrophes, it is tempting to think of them as distant tragedies belonging to another world. Yet if we look carefully, we can already see a version of that same story unfolding around us today. Coastal cities are expanding faster than at any time in human history. More than half of the world's population now lives near the ocean. Vast urban skylines rise along coastlines that, in geological terms, are temporary boundaries between land and sea. And the ocean is not fixed. It never has been. Projections from climate scientists suggest that sea levels could rise significantly over the next centuries. Even a 1-meter increase would transform coastlines around the world. Low-lying districts of major cities could experience frequent flooding. Entire neighborhoods might require massive engineering projects to remain habitable. In some regions, retreat from the coastline may become the only long-term option. The idea that cities like Miami, Shanghai, or Jakarta could one day struggle to remain above water may seem extraordinary. But the people of ancient coastal civilizations might have thought the same thing. Their harbors were thriving. Their trade networks were expanding. Their communities were stable. Until they weren't. If the seas continue rising for centuries, the cities of our own era may eventually face a similar transformation. Not overnight, and not necessarily within our lifetimes, but across the slow passage of generations. Imagine a diver exploring the ruins of a modern skyline thousands of years from now. Towering structures covered in coral, submerged streets where fish swim through the empty windows of abandoned buildings, fragments of bridges and highways resting quietly beneath layers of sand. To those future explorers, our world might look just as mysterious as Pavlopetri looks to us today. They might wonder, who lived there? What kind of civilization built such enormous cities? Why those cities were abandoned? And whether the people who once lived there saw the change coming. That possibility transforms the story of underwater ruins into something far more profound than a simple archaeological mystery. Because every drowned city we have explored so far tells the same quiet lesson. Civilizations are temporary. Landscapes change. Oceans move. And human history is only a small moment within a much larger planetary story. Somewhere beneath the waves today lie countless places we have not yet discovered. Ancient shorelines, forgotten settlements, entire worlds erased by rising seas long before written history began. Every year, new technologies allow scientists to map deeper parts of the ocean floor, revealing patterns and structures that hint at stories still waiting to be uncovered. And perhaps that is the most fascinating truth of all. The ocean does not only hide the past, it preserves it. Beneath the surface of the water, protected from wind and weather, fragments of human history remain suspended in time. Streets that no one has walked for thousands of years, walls that once protected homes and temples, harbors that once welcomed ships from distant lands, places where life once unfolded exactly as it does in our cities today. The difference is that those people never expected their world to disappear beneath the sea. And that realization leaves us with one final question. When future explorers descend into the deep oceans of the earth, searching for traces of ancient civilizations, what remains of our own world will they find waiting there?